Hey everyone, this is Peter Sco for Music is a Journey. You know, in the last few years that I've been making these videos, I've looked into a lot of band histories and band discographies, and especially this year when I was making my list of the first 10 albums of specific bands, particularly Aerosmith and Blue Oyster Cult, and also when I was looking into the discography of the Scorpions, and as well I watched other people giving their rankings for albums by AC/DC or Kiss. There was a name that kept popping up all the time, and so I really felt I wanted to make a video about this person. That name is Bruce Fairbairn, producer Bruce Fairbairn from Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. So I took a little bit of a look into his history, checked out a few things on some websites, and I realized I already had quite a few albums that he was behind, and I picked up a few more. And so today, or for this video here, I want to talk about the history of Bruce Fairbairn. So when Bruce was 5 years old, he visited a neighbor who took him down to the cellar and opened up this old wooden trunk, and inside was this shining trumpet. And his neighbor took it out and played it a little bit, and Bruce was mesmerized. He just fell in love with the instrument. So his neighbor showed him how to play some things and taught him how to play taps, and told him that every night or every evening when the sun went down, he had to stand out on his porch and play taps. So he did that for a while, and he really wanted to learn to play the instrument more. So his neighbor said, okay, I'll rent it to you for a nickel. I don't know if it was a nickel a week or a nickel a month anyway, but you've got to take lessons to learn how to play it. And so he did. So when Bruce was in high school, he started playing in a band called Spector's Rhythm and Blues Review, which later on just changed the name to Spector's. And then in the early 70s, he started a band called Sunshine. That's Sunshine with a Y instead of an I. And it was a band based on the style of like Blood, Sweat and Tears or Chicago, where it was a larger band with a horn section, of course. But as the mid-70s approached, he decided that he should move the band in a different direction and go more towards a melodic rock sound. So he took Jim Vallance with him, and also from another Vancouver band, Seeds of Time, they got Lindsay Mitchell over on guitar, and they wrote a song called, actually Jim Vallance wrote a song called Open Soul Surgery. They recorded some demos and tried to shop them around, but there wasn't really any interest in the demos that they were sending out. So Bruce, who had already completed a university, gotten a degree in biological sciences, decided he would go back for environmental engineering. And it was during this time, he was still playing gigs and so on, earning money to pay for university. It was during this time that a friend of his, who was a lawyer, called him and said, I gave your demo to a guy in LA and he's interested in signing the band to a label. So, very quickly, they suddenly had to put a band together. So they gathered a bunch of guys, and Jim Vallance agreed to play the drums for the band under an alias of Rodney Higgs, but he didn't actually want to be an official part of this new band. By the way, the original name for the band was Stanley Screamer, but they changed it to Prism afterwards. And so Prism was born, bringing in Lindsay Mitchell on guitar, and 5 other members. Rodney Higgs, anyway, on drums for the first album, and Bruce Fairbairn decided that he didn't want to be an official member of the band, but that he would produce the album. And also he played one of 2 people playing horns on the debut album. So Prism's debut album was released in 1977, and it featured the tracks Spaceship Superstar, which you may have heard. An interesting song because it has this kind of spacey intro, and it goes through verse, chorus, has a keyboard solo, and it's done. That's it. The song wraps up after the keyboard solo. But it's pretty cool though. And then there was also Take Me to the Captain, which was also a hit in Canada. The album actually went platinum in Canada, as well as did their second album in 1978 called See Forever Eyes. So of course Bruce producing this one as well. But it was the 1979 album Armageddon that really scored big for the band, and they sold double platinum in Canada as well. Bruce Fairbairn was awarded the Juno Award for Producer of the Year, Juno Awards being the top music awards in Canada. This features the song Armageddon, which I talked about in a previous video, how it has this really wonderful orchestral beginning that sounds like a kind of salute to the end of the world, a rock song in the middle, and then wrapping up with the orchestra again. Another song on here, You Walked Away Again, was actually a song written by Jim Vallance and a young Bryan Adams. Jim Vallance and Bryan Adams would team up to become songwriting partners. So that was kind of interesting. They released one more album called Young and Restless in 1980, as well as a live album. But then after that, Prism split up, and Bruce Fairbairn actually got another band on his doorstep. Bruce Allen, who was a promoter before, had become the manager for Prism, and he got in touch with another band that was up and coming. This was a band called Loverboy. And so Bruce Fairbairn produced their first album here, Loverboy, released in 1980. This also has been voted as one of the worst rock album covers of all time. And their 1981 album, Get Lucky. Now, already from the debut, they got a hit with The Kid Is Hot Tonight and Turn Me Loose. The album actually did really well, but it was the second album, 1981's Get Lucky, that really scored big for the band. Of course, with Working for the Weekend, When It's Over, and Take Me to the Top were 3 hit songs off that album. The album went to number 7 on the US Billboard, and let's see here, it stayed in the charts for 2 years in the Billboard Top 200, selling 4 million copies in the US alone. An interesting side note, on the cover there is somebody wearing kind of reddish leather pants. For a long time it was wondered, people wondered who was wearing these pants, because a couple of the band members, were seen to wear red leather pants before, but apparently it was the photographer who was in New York, picked up a pair of red leather pants, brought them back, and found nobody could fit them until his 13-year-old daughter said, "Let me try them on," and she fit them. So that's his 13-year-old daughter's backside on the cover of the album there, along with somebody's crossed fingers. But anyway, yeah, with the success of Loverboy, Bruce Fairbairn's name actually started to go across the border and internationally. However, in the meantime, he was still producing bands for local people, such as a fellow named Ian Lloyd, who had gone solo. He produced a couple of albums for Ian Lloyd, and a local Vancouver band called Strange Advance, which was more of a new wave type band. But anyway, the name Bruce Fairbairn spread across the border, and so the first international from a Canadian perspective, band to approach him was Blue Oyster Cult. Now, Blue Oyster Cult had recently been on a big roll of success. Their album Cultosaurus Erectus had landed them a tour with Black Sabbath. After that, they followed it up with Fire of Unknown Origin, with the hit Burning for You, which became one of their few big hit songs. As well, they released Extraterrestrial Live, their third live album, which was also a sensation, and they actually had a song or two in the heavy metal movie soundtrack. So things were looking really good for Blue Oyster Cult, except that during the last tour, their drummer, one of the founding members of the 5 guys of the classic lineup, Alan Bouchard, suddenly started showing up late for gigs, and a couple of times not even showing up at all, and so finally he was fired from the band. So Blue Oyster Cult had brought in a new drummer, and were now thinking what to do next. Should they try to go in a more kind of mainstream pop direction? Maybe that's why they called on Bruce Fairbairn, because already he'd had success with this melodic rock bands, Prism and Loverboy. So he produced Blue Oyster Cult's The Revolution by Night. Now, one song off here was Shooting Shark, which was actually, the lyrics were based on a poem by Patti Smith. That song actually did all right in the charts. Not a major hit, but it landed on the charts. And the other song on here, Take Me Away, was probably the hardest rocking track on the album. Also featuring Canadian rocker Aldo Nova, who had recently had a hit with his song Fantasy. He was brought in as a co-writer and as well playing keyboards synthesizer in part of the song, probably during those spacey effect parts there just before the guitar solo. Anyway, unfortunately this album did not bring the expectations that Blue Oyster Cult had hoped. Things seemed to continue to slide for the band, and founding member Alan Latimer, who was keyboardist and had been with Donald Roser since 1967, he also left the band after this album. So unfortunately, there was not much that could be done with Bruce Fairbairn's help there. However, his name was still going around, and the next band to call him up came overseas from Switzerland. This is Krokus with their album The Blitz, released in 1984. Interesting thing for me, this album is really a heavy metal album from 1984. It's not heavy metal by today's standards. This is more of a, the glam metal thing, which is basically based on melodic hard rock, but with a heavy metal setup. But anyway, I think it's a really strong album. There are a lot of great songs on here. There are no power ballads. And there was one interesting thing I found when I listened to it again recently. There's a song on here called Our Love, which sounds like it should be a power ballad, but it's not. It is still a rock song. But there is an interesting thing near the end of the song, just after the guitar solo. Let me be a little bit sneaky and fit it in here. Listen to it. Does that sound familiar to any of you? Because in the 1980s, it was just a riff for me. However, more recently, in the last several years, I found the source of that riff. Let me be sneaky. Here's the original. That is from Gentle Giant's Three Friends. So the interesting thing about Krokus is they do actually pay a lot of homage to their influences in the 1970s. They actually did start out as a prog band, but then, after hearing AC/DC, they decided they wanted to go more in that direction and brought in Mark Storek on vocals, who has kind of similarities to Bon Scott. Anyway, with the Blitz album, they covered Sweet's Ballroom Blitz, and yeah, this is a pretty strong 1984 glam metal, heavy metal album for the day. Next, coming across the border from the US was Black and Blue. They put out a pretty decent debut album, and they were looking to Bruce Fairbairn to see what he could do for their second album to bring them more success. So they came out here with Without Love. Now, this album is actually one of my favorite hair metal, glam metal albums from the 80s. And I recently read in a couple of interviews with people who had worked with Bruce Fairbairn, like engineer Mike Fraser. I think he and another person, both of them said that this is a really strong album, one of their favorites from the 80s as well. This is an album where I can listen to every song. Like, every single song is a standout track for me. It's an album where you can remember all the songs. You know, there are some albums, like their debut, for example, there were a couple of good songs on there I remember, and the rest of the album was kind of same-ish, you know? But this one here I felt really had good variety. You've got a song like Swing Time, which has a kind of like, upbeat swing band rhythm to it, but it's all done with electric guitars. You've got like a melodic song like Miss Mystery, or Without Love, which is a little more of a rocker anyway, not really a ballad. Even the opening track there, Rockin' on Heaven's Door. Is it Rockin'? Is Rockin', right? Rockin' on Heaven's Door. Very good, catchy rock songs. Good melodies, sometimes a little bit on the heavy side, like with Bombastic Plastic, but often on the more melodic side. Basically just a really great album. Unfortunately, Black and Blue did not get the success they were hoping for, and they thought that maybe the Bruce Fairbairn approach was making them too much like a melodic rock band and not a real serious metal band, hard rockin' band anyway. So for their third album, they went off and sought out Gene Simmons to be their producer. And there's a kind of interesting twist to that, which I'll mention a little bit later. And another album that Bruce Fairbairn produced in 1985 was Honeymoon Suite's second album, The Big Prize, which, according to their guitarist, he felt that was their best album. The Black and Blue's Without Love did not reach the success that they'd hoped for. However, it did catch the attention of one other person out there on the East Coast. John Bon Jovi decided that he liked what Bruce had done for the album and came over to Vancouver to see him and brought him in to produce the band's third album, Slippery When Wet. Incidentally, the title Slippery When Wet was taken from a sign outside a shower in a strip club. If you don't know, Vancouver has a lot of strip clubs. Anyway, Bruce almost got fired early on because one day John took him out in his car for a drive and he said, "You know what, Bruce, you're not really saying much. You're not showing up for the parties and I don't really feel you're on board with us." And Bruce just simply said, "That's not the way I work, that's all." Actually, Bruce Fairbairn had a pretty strict working schedule. He liked to stay in the studio for basically 8 hours, put in an 8-hour workday, but he had a very tight schedule, everything planned out what he thought they should achieve during that day. He also had what they called the half-hour rule. If somebody was having trouble with an instrument or something and not quite getting it, he gave him about half an hour, and if he couldn't pull it off then, he said, "Fine, take it back to the hotel with you and work on it. We'll bring it in another time." One of the things Bruce didn't want to do was have a lot of frustrations or tensions in the studio. In fact, even when tensions arose between band members, he was a pretty good mediator to get everyone to kind of calm down again. In fact, a lot of bands said that they really enjoyed working with him because he was easygoing, but at the same time he kept a very strict schedule, and basically he taught the bands to be really professional and also get them to do what they could do best. He was actually called sometimes the school teacher even afterwards, because a lot of bands felt it was kind of like being in school with him. But anyway, the resulting album for Bon Jovi's third album, of course, was Slippery When Wet. And when it was coming out, Bruce said, "I think we can probably sell about 500,000 copies with that. We should be pretty good." And that sounded great because that was more than what the previous albums had sold. They had no idea that the album would go on to sell 17 million copies, or that the band would end up being an international success with songs like Living on a Prayer, Wanted Dead or Alive. In fact, Living on a Prayer did so well for the band that John Bon Jovi feared that he might not be able to write another single of that success. And so he tried so hard for the next album to write a song similar to Living on a Prayer. He actually wrote a song using basically the same chord sequence. So that idea had to be scrapped. However, they did go back to Bruce Fairbairn again for their next album, New Jersey. Now I'm going to tell you, in the 1980s, I did have all 4 Bon Jovi albums, the first 4 on cassette. I was not a tremendously huge fan enough that I went to see the Slippery When Wet concert in Vancouver with Cinderella opening. But I remember when I got New Jersey, I felt the band had taken their abilities to a new level. It was like the first 3 albums they were stepping up, and then New Jersey was where they actually stepped out on the stage. Bruce Fairbairn said it was a big pleasure to work with Bon Jovi because in spite of all the success and all the hit songs, the band was actually really good. They were really good at what they did and very good to work with in the studio. Very professional gentlemen. Anyway, New Jersey came out, and I think this holds the record for having the most top 10 singles of any glam metal, hair metal, hard rock album of the 1980s. I don't even remember what they all were, but I think Bad Medicine is probably the most famous one. I do tend to get a little, tired of hearing the Bon Jovi songs over and over again, but I have to say, Bad Medicine is really well done. And I really like, there's one line in the song where first he sings something about running out of breath. "I need a respirator because I'm running out of breath." And by the time that verse concludes, it's just the drums going and he's like singing and he's almost out of breath, and then he just finishes with a "oh" at the very end. You can feel he's really running out of breath. It's got some good riffs. There's a lot of actually cool hard rocking riffs on here. There's good use of keyboards and even organ at times. Yeah, there's some tracks like Living in Sin, Born to Be My Baby, Blood on Blood. Yeah, okay, and it's not really my type of thing. But Homebound Train is a pretty good, solid bluesy rocker. And there's some other cool tracks on here. Love for Sale, kind of an amusing acoustic blues piece at the end with some, funny quips by John and Richie Sambora. But anyway, New Jersey, another big success for the band. All right, so also here during the 1980s, let me see. The next big celebs to come through the doorway, Aerosmith, came up to Vancouver. This is an interesting thing because not long ago I watched a video on the Sea of Tranquility YouTube channel with Pete Pardo and guest Martin Popoff. They often do videos together chatting about various topics. And one of the things they talked about in one video was bands of the 70s, how they coped with the 80s. Because the 80s were a very hard time for bands of the 70s, as we saw with Blue Oyster Cult. And Aerosmith too. Aerosmith were, they crashed at the beginning of the 80s because of all their drug problems. 2 key members left the band. The band almost wrapped up. They finally managed to agree to get themselves back together, and their comeback album, Done with Mirrors, was alright. It was alright. It had some good stuff on it, but it didn't really put Aerosmith back in the saddle. So what did they do? As Martin Popoff said, what some bands did, go to Vancouver, try harder. So that's what they did. They hooked up with Bruce Fairbairn in Vancouver, and it was just such a session. The guys were clean and only a few weeks off all the hard stuff and everything. They were sober, they were excited about recording together, and they just had so many ideas, and Bruce just let them go with it. Steven Tyler said, "We could truly be ourselves in the studio." And he said also that this was the first album recording that he actually remembers. So, Permanent Vacation, of course, coming out with stuff like Ragdoll, Heart's Done Time, Magic Touch, Angel, the big, power ballad off here. Just a diverse and really terrific, fun album. I know some people don't like it because it's a little bit too diverse compared to the 1970s classic Aerosmith, but I think for 1987, this is a brilliant piece of work. When everybody's going for the power ballad and the hair metal style, Aerosmith did something really different. And of course, this album was a huge success for them, as was their follow-up album, also produced by Bruce Fairbairn, Pump, which had, 4 top 10 hits off of here? I don't know if they were top 10, but 4 chart-topping singles on here. Anyway, 2 terrific albums, and in fact, the album after that, Get a Grip, which I haven't got yet, haven't gotten a grip yet. Bruce Fairbairn produced that one as well. And Permanent Vacation, Pump, and Get a Grip are 3 of Aerosmith's biggest selling albums, if not their biggest selling run of 3 albums in a row. I really gotta get it. So, yeah, the magic was happening. Things were happening. Also, in 1987, Rock and Hyde, that's Bob Rock and Paul Hyde, who had been together in a band called Payolas, later on changed to Paul Hyde and the Payolas, and finally just became Rock and Hyde. Bob Rock was also the engineer in the studio with Bruce Fairbairn. So Bob Rock and Bruce Fairbairn in the studio, producer and engineer. Bruce Fairbairn wasn't into the technical side of things. He didn't really want to get into the engineering part. He wanted to do the more of, getting the band to do the things that they could do, getting them to play the songs, hear what they could do, work out ideas with the band, get them to, put the whole thing together. That was more his kind of deal there. Anyway, he also did a band called the Dan Reed Network, their debut album in 1988. However, that didn't really get so much promotion, and so even though he said it was an album he really had high hopes for and thought was very well done, didn't get the promotion it needed from the record company. Then we hit 1989 with Aerosmith's Pump, as well as Gorky Park from Russia. Their debut album was produced by Bruce Fairbairn. And then in 1990, things got really busy. So first of all, we had AC/DC. I don't know if this is the correct order, but anyway, 1990, AC/DC came along with the Razor's Edge. AC/DC, of course, had their big success there in the latter half of the 70s with Highway to Hell especially, and then Back in Black being one of the top-selling rock albums of all time, featuring Brian Johnson on vocals after the sad passing of Bon Scott. But after that, AC/DC's fortunes kind of started to falter. For Those About to Rock was a great album, I think, but people say not as good as Back in Black. Flick of the Switch, again, some good tracks, but not as good as the previous 2. And then we get on to Fly on the Wall and Blow Up Your Video, which both sit pretty low in the ranking the albums of AC/DC videos that I've seen. So, things were, AC/DC were still doing fine. They had also done, music for the soundtrack of Maximum Overdrive. But things were not as good as they could have been, and so the band went to Vancouver to try harder with Bruce Fairbairn and came up with The Razor's Edge. And of course, this is the album that features Thunderstruck, which is one of the signature AC/DC songs. Pretty cool that actually AC/DC can produce one of their signature songs so well into their career. As well, Money Talks is one of the big songs off of this one. And I only got this a couple of months back, but at first I thought there's only 2 or 3 songs on here that are really all that great, but I listened to it again the other day and it's growing on me. There's some If You Dare I liked, and The Razor's Edge, the title track, is pretty cool. Mistress for Christmas is a little bit, alright. Alright, But actually, not a bad album, not a bad album. Certainly, people in their rankings of the AC/DC albums from the latter half of their career, this is one of the higher rated albums. Also in 1990, Paul Lane, I think a guitarist from Vancouver Island, his album Stick It In Your Ear. I remember my friend had that on cassette. And then Poison, Flesh and Blood. I don't know, was that their 3rd, their 4th album? Anyway, also produced by Bruce Fairbairn. Oh, AC/DC Live in 1991. And then we get on to 1993 with Aerosmith's Get a Grip, and another band recently lost a drummer, like with Blue Oyster Cult. Scorpions. Herman Rarebell had left the band, and Scorpions went up to Vancouver to put out their next album. The previous one, It's a Crazy World, It's a Crazy World, had a big hit for them with Wind of Change. So this album here, I just got this a few weeks back, and it's much better than I thought. In the rankings of Scorpions albums, this is kind of the lower end of the middle. People saying there are a couple of good tracks on here, but the rest of it is kind of just okay. I actually think this is a pretty good, solid Scorpions album. There's a kind of a problem here, is that this album came out in 1993, and of course 1991, Nirvana's Nevermind, 92 is kind of the big year for grunge. This album could have done much better had it been released in, say, like 1986, I think. And there are a couple of really good, catchy songs on here, too. I think Someone to Touch would easily have been a popular song, I think, had this been released in 1986. However, 1993, I think it struggled. Yeah, I think it's a great album. Bruce Fairburn's comment about it not getting the success for the band as they'd hoped was just that he said there just wasn't really that song. Like Rock You Like a Hurricane, everybody loves Rock You Like a Hurricane. There wasn't a Rock You Like a Hurricane, or Bad Boys Running Wild, or Big City Nights, or even No One Like You. There wasn't that kind of a song on there. But also I think it just wasn't the timing for it. 1993? Yeah. The only thing I'm going to say about this one here is I think I must have a remastered copy, because it's loud, and I can actually hear a bit of scratchiness on a couple of the tracks in the background, which I think is due to the, the pushing of the volume up a bit too much. But other than that, yeah, I say it's a pretty good album. All right, for the rest of the 1990s, we had Van Halen's Balance. The last album was Sammy Hagar. That is actually an interesting one to read about, because basically the tensions between Sammy Hagar and Eddie Van Halen were really coming to a head. The Van Halen brothers and Sammy Hagar not getting along. Michael Anthony just, being in the background. But what I heard from, I think it was Mike Plotnikoff, who was one of the second engineer on the album, he said that in the studio, everyone was really great. Especially Eddie and Alex. They were really happy, friendly guys. And they had, of course, also recently gotten off the alcohol and so on. But Eddie was a particularly hard-working guy. He could sit down, play out 3 guitar solos for a song, all of them being perfect, any of them being great for the song. He was just an amazing person, but also a really hard-working person, and worked very well with the team. So one of the big issues was that Eddie Van Halen was a kind of workaholic. He wanted to spend as much time in the studio working on the tracks as much as possible, whereas Sammy Hagar was more of a guy who went in, did his thing, and left again. And so they said like he would show up for, between like 2 and 3 or 2 and 4 in the afternoon, do his thing, and then he would leave again because he had some other engagements. And that was the big point of contention between the Van Halen brothers and Sammy Hagar, was basically that especially Eddie Van Halen wanted to put as much time and effort into the album as possible, whereas Sammy was more interested in doing other things. This is not to say anything against Sammy Hagar, just perhaps he was also losing interest in being in the band. I've heard he had some comments about that in the past. Hi, Miko. Miko's up visiting now. But anyway, that was the last album with Sammy Hagar. An interesting thing I heard about how it was that Van Halen decided to go with Bruce Fairbairn. They they met with different producers, and each producer would come in, give a list of their credentials, and say what songs they liked about the band. Whereas Bruce Fairbairn came in, introduced himself, and said to the guys, "All right, let's hear the music." And Van Halen were just really impressed with that. They thought, here's a guy who wants to know what we're doing now, not talk about past successes of the band or the producer himself. So that was really cool. So then in 1996, we have Chicago with Night and Day, a big band album, a little bit something different for them, rather than their kind of, adult contemporary pop that they had become in the 1980s. And the Cranberries with To the Faithful Departed. 1997, In Excess with Elegantly Wasted. Didn't score the sales that they had hoped for, however, it was well received by the critics. And also in 1997, Noise Therapy, a Vancouver alternative metal band, had an EP called Cyclops, 5 tracks, which I actually used to have. And I thought it was pretty cool at the time, but in later years when I went back to it, it just really didn't grip me the way it had when I first got it, and I ended up letting go of it. So, yeah, well, I didn't know. Maybe I should have kept it. 1998, we get Kiss with Psycho Circus. And this is interesting. This was remember I said Black and Blue, they went off to get Gene Simmons to produce their next album because they weren't happy with the results of the Bruce Fairbairn produced album. Well, Kiss sought out Bruce Fairbairn, 14 years later. So Psycho Circus was supposed to be the big reunion with Ace Frehley and Peter Criss, but turned out to be quite a disaster, really. Peter Criss actually only playing drums on one song on the album, a song written by Ace Frehley. Ace Frehley appearing only on a couple of the tracks as well. Only one track with all 4 members singing. Apparently Paul and Gene being pretty heavy-handed on the other 2. In interviews coming up with, depending on the interview, all sorts of reasons of why things didn't work out. The other guys weren't as serious, they weren't as into it, or they were trying to renegotiate their contracts, or whatever, lots of different reasons. Anyway, I am not a totally huge Kiss fan. However, I was curious and checked out the album a bit on YouTube. I thought it sounded pretty good. Although Martin Popoff, I know, has a pretty low opinion of the album. He said it was a kind of a sick joke, really. But, I often don't agree with Martin Popoff, even though I totally respect him for his knowledge as a rock journalist and author. But anyway, I think I might have to get a hold of that one as well. I'm kind of curious, Sounded pretty good. So, there was some other band after that, again, a kind of swing band, and then the final Bruce Fairbairn album. The Ladder by Yes. Very interesting. Progressive rock band, Yes. Big name band. They'd come through a really turbulent history, scoring some success in the 80s, then came the whole thing with John Anderson leaving, teaming up with Bill Bruford, Rick Wakeman, and Steve Howe, forming Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman, Howe. The Trevor Rabin continuing on with Chris Squire and Alan White and Tony Kaye. And then, both bands being basically forced together to make a Yes Union album, which was a real disaster from the perspective of what a Yes album should not be. And again, everybody dissolving the Trevor Rabin lineup, putting out one more album, which didn't do all that well, but I think is actually the best of the 3. And then the classic Tales from Topographic Oceans lineup gathering together, doing a live album, recording some studio material, the record company not really sure what they wanted to do with it, Rick Wakeman leaving again, Chris Squire going off with Billy Sherwood to write some material, which then got co-opted into a new Yes album, where they just said, well then bring in John Anderson and Steve Howe back in again, and they added some contributions at the end for Open Your Eyes, which a lot of people really don't like very much. So, then the 3 guys, Steve Howe, John Anderson, and Chris Squire, 4th guy, Alan White, team up with, I've forgotten his name now, but a Russian keyboard player who actually had been a session player on Open Your Eyes. They made him a full-time member. They went to Vancouver and they produced The Ladder. Comments of the band, they said when they went in the studio with Bruce Fairbairn, he said, you're not going to make like a chart-topping album. Just make the best album you guys can as Yes. And there are a lot of really cool tracks on here, especially the opening one, what's it called? Homeworld, The Ladder. That's actually one that Yes fans tend to really like. There's a lot of variety on here though. There's some very almost kind of like poppy stuff, and of course some brass in there, which doesn't sound like something you'd expect from a Yes album. But aside from a couple of tracks which kind of, I can deal with, I actually think it's quite an interesting album. The sad thing is that one day the members showed up on time in the studio and Bruce wasn't there, which never happened. Bruce always stuck to his work schedule. If he said we're starting at noon, he was there, and he didn't show up. And so John Anderson and someone else from the studio went to Bruce's house and found him dead. Mysterious causes. The Wikipedia article doesn't reveal how he died. He was just simply found dead at home at the age of 49. So the album was finished with, I think it was Mike Fraser, the engineer, who finished producing the album, and it was released. There was a memorial service, a kind of, not a memorial service, a celebration of the life and achievements of Bruce Fairbairn. Steve Howe and John Anderson played the song Nine Voices, one of the songs from the album here. There were some other guests. There were, people like John Bon Jovi, people sending in their comments, the sad loss of this great guy. And at the end, the final thing, his son played taps on the trumpet, which is, really appropriate because that's where his whole musical journey began when he was 5 years old. In the year 2000, posthumously, he was inducted into the Canadian Music Hall of Fame, also with a Juno Award. He'd actually won a total of 3 Juno Awards and had 11 nominations throughout his career. So a very shocking, surprising, and tragic ending to the whole thing. But what a career. He actually had produced 50 albums during his career, and many of them, like Bon Jovi and Aerosmith, for example, even AC/DC, had gone on to be huge sellers. Loverboy too as well. So, who knows what he could have done in the 2000s, when melodic rock started making a kind of comeback again. But he wasn't just a melodic rock producer, because he also did Strange Advance as a new wave album. He also did, something Fireballs, a swing album, Chicago as a big band album. Whatever the artist did, that's what he helped them bring out and make the best use of their abilities. So there you have it, a review of Bruce Fairbairn's life as a producer and all the great albums he did, whether they were big sellers or not. Anyway, there you go. Check your record collections then. You've probably got some of these albums in as well. Okay. Anyway, thank you all for watching another long video, and we'll see you again in another video sometime in the near future. Take care all. Bye.